Hello, my name is Sarah Carr, and today I'll be sharing about my thesis project, Stabilization of Youth in the Child Welfare System, Prevention for Foster Youth at Risk of Domestic Minor Sex Trafficking. Social services come in contact with victims of human trafficking every single day. Today I will discuss the specific strategies my research project unearthed to help prevent human trafficking of youth in the child welfare system. The core of these strategies can be summarized by relational support and teamwork. These principles can be applied to any area of social services. These findings pertain to you as directors of social services, as they enhance the quality of services provided to the most vulnerable in society and toward prevention efforts. Today I want to tell you several stories. The first is about a youth in foster care named Cece. Cece entered the child welfare system at age 13. Cece was brought into the child welfare system due to physical, sexual, and emotional abuse by her stepfather. Cece lived with relatives for a brief amount of time. However, she was soon hospitalized after a suicide attempt. It was determined by social services that Cece was no longer safe in her relative's home, so she was placed in a group home for a higher level of care. Within a matter of weeks, Cece ran away with other youth from the group home and met the two men who would soon become her traffickers. Cece continuously ran away. And at the time I was an intern, I watched the social worker and the supervisor struggle to help Cece. Cece was victimized by sex trafficking or commercial sexual exploitation for the first time while in the care of the child welfare services. I was angered by this and began to get curious about what the social service agency could have done to help stabilize this youth and keep her safe. It's stories like Cece's that spark my curiosity and my passion to find ways to stabilize youth at risk of commercial sexual exploitation while in the child welfare system. Prior to obtaining a master's in social work from Fresno State, I worked in a shelter for human trafficking survivors. I listened to numerous stories of how their exploitation began when they were children. I heard stories of youth victimized of sex trafficking for the first time after entering the child welfare system. And as I began to learn about the signs and the factors that make individuals vulnerable, I was reminded of a close friend of mine in high school. My friend was in foster care and ran away frequently. I remember sitting in choir class, wondering where she was and feeling sick with concern. When she would return, she would tell me all these stories of experimenting with drugs and having sex with strangers in order to have a place to stay. And I realized that my friend in high school was a victim of sex trafficking, and she is also my why. So my curiosity led to my research question. What are the most effective intervention strategies to stabilize youth and reduce the risk of domestic minor sex trafficking while in the child welfare system? So some definitions. This definition is the federal definition, and it negates the necessity to prove force, fraud, or coercion for minors under the age of 18. So consequently, anyone under the age of 18 involved in a commercial sex act is considered a victim of domestic minor sex trafficking. A commercial sex act includes any sex act on account which anything of value is given to or received by a person. So it doesn't have to necessarily be money in exchange for a sex act. It can be a place to stay, food, clothing, etc. Commercial sexual exploitation of children, a range of crimes and activities involving the sexual abuse or exploitation of a child for the financial benefit of any person in exchange for anything of value, including monetary and non-monetary benefits given or received by any person. According to the National Human Trafficking Hotline, California had the highest number of reported cases in the nation in 2016, with 1,331 cases. Now I'd like to share with you Charlie's story. Charlie began in foster care since the age of 8 in the Central Valley. She's now 16 years old, and she's had 45 placements over the years, 20 of which have been group homes. Charlie is a chronic runaway. She frequently runs away, and this makes it challenging for social workers to connect Charlie with services to meet her physical, mental health, and educational needs. Charlie was also victimized of commercial sexual exploitation for the first time in the child welfare system, like CC, except Charlie had 4 different abusers, all while in foster care and on the run. Charlie was, how can I say, difficult to work with. She would often get in fights with other youth in the group home and get in fights with staff in the group home. She would experiment with drugs and alcohol while on the run, which would further her harm and harm her mental health and physical safety. For years, the social workers assigned to Charlie's case were at a loss until 2 years ago, Charlie's unit began a different approach. Charlie's social worker, along with the supervisor and team of social workers within the Child Welfare Agency, began to utilize relational support, harm reduction, and teamwork to stabilize Charlie. The team of social workers held a multidisciplinary team meeting to gather service providers from outside agencies, including local drop-in center case managers, Charlie's assigned therapists, 2 of Charlie's relatives, a representative from Charlie's school, and Charlie's new resource parent. The team came up with a plan, including Charlie, and planned to have someone meet with Charlie several times a week. The team also utilized a harm reduction strategy by asking Charlie what it would take for her to stay in placement. Charlie shared that she had never been to the beach. So Charlie agreed to stay in placement for 2 months in exchange for a trip to the beach. With the relational support of the team of social workers and the incentive, Charlie stabilized for 3 months. Charlie's stabilization meant that for 3 months, she regularly attended school, she regularly met with her therapist, and for 3 months, Charlie was not on the streets and Charlie was not exploited. Charlie's name and identifying details have been changed to protect her identity. Charlie's story was mentioned multiple times during my research study as I was interviewing social workers. Her story became a success story of how to stabilize youth victimized of commercial sexual exploitation. The problem: youth in the child welfare system are frequently missing from placement and are at risk to be victimized of commercial sexual exploitation due to their vulnerability while missing from care. One study showed that 60% of child sex trafficking victims have a history in the child welfare system. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children reported 86% of victims of domestic minor sex trafficking in the United States were involved with the child welfare system. My research study is timely, as in the year 2017, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children received over 18,000 reports of youth missing from placement across the United States. The agency estimated 16% of those individuals were victimized by domestic minor sex trafficking. One researcher attributed the high risk of domestic minor sex trafficking for youth in the child welfare system due to their lack of opportunities to create long-term relationships, less supervision by adults, and high rates of peer recruitment in foster care placements and group homes. The interaction of youth with the child welfare system as a potential risk factor due to the youth growing accustomed to transient nature of foster care. Another scholar went as far as to say that the child welfare system prepares children for sex trafficking, as one youth shared in their study, Being in foster care was the perfect training for commercial sexual exploitation. The association between domestic minor sex trafficking and the child welfare system is very problematic to the well-being of an already vulnerable population in society. Youth missing from foster care brought me back to my research question. How can we stabilize these youth in order to reduce the risk of exploitation? I wanted to know how we can connect these youth to meaningful relationships so that they do not run from placement. In my literature review, I found the progress of research thus far to prevent commercial sexual exploitation of youth in the child welfare system includes the identification of risk factors in order to identify those youth who are at an increased risk. These led to identification tools for agencies such as the West Coast Clinic identification tool, which several of the counties in the Central Valley are using this tool. I found in the literature review identification of reasons why youth run from care, which involves youth running to access their support systems. The current literature is lacking in evidence-based support systems to prevent youth who are at risk of domestic minor sex trafficking, and also there is not enough research done in the Central Valley of California. My conceptual framework, I used critical theory or theory of critical consciousness, which is similar in nature to structural social work theory, as they both aim to increase the connectivity between socio-political and economic systems to see the root of social issues is beyond the individual. These theories involve seeing the intersectionality that make youth vulnerable to trafficking. They go beyond blaming the individual for their behavior to explore what structural factors are sources of oppression for the youth. My methodology was a qualitative research project. I used structured interviews. I used purposeful sampling, so I only interviewed social workers who had direct practice experience with youth at risk or victimized of commercial sexual exploitation. I conducted a thematic analysis, and I used Charlie's case study. So my findings, in Charlie's story specifically, how did service providers stabilize Charlie? They used harm reduction. They met Charlie where she was at. They were available for her on the run, and they educated her. They used incentives. They gave the youth agency, and it took a team of social service providers to stabilize Charlie. A therapist or a social worker met with her multiple times a week, providing relational support, and there were multidisciplinary team meetings, which were instrumental in stabilizing Charlie. So why is this important? Social service agencies work with some of the most complex cases. Charlie's story is an example of an extremely complex case. So social service providers must be creative and open to using harm reduction with clients and working as a team to solve these issues, such as prevention of domestic minor sex trafficking. My recommendations are that social workers would use relational support. They would meet clients where they are and use harm reduction in addressing their challenges, and that they would use multidisciplinary collaborations to use a team of professionals to support the youth and help stabilize them. I would also like to recommend your further support for research for specific evidence-based interventions to stabilize this population specifically. I recommend future researchers to conduct a quantitative study on the effectiveness of interventions, and this would require the resources to track interventions. We have the responsibility to protect youth in the child welfare system, and my recommendation for you as agency directors is to facilitate and encourage social workers to use relational support, harm reduction, and to work collaboratively as teams to support this population. Thank you for your time. And if you have any questions, here's my contact information. And I look forward to talking with you soon.